The next speaker is Qasim Zaidi, and he's a sort of godfather of vision science. And from the SUNY Optometry, and so the parallel processing for shape and material perception.
Boy, the demands. So this was a much larger talk, and I shortened it by taking out equations and abstract notions. It'll be a very nuts and bolts sort of talk. So just like a lot of you, I'm interested in shape and material perception, though I've never studied the two together. And this, of course, represents what we all see. There's a picture of the world on our retina, and we make inferences like these. And so part of this talk will be what, in two areas, what is the kind of information that comes from the world that is useful for material recognition and for shape, and for getting 3D shapes. And why did I use the term parallel? Well, we know there are lots and lots of people working on parallel processes in vision, and it means lots of different sorts of things. I want to take one interesting case which we have known for a very long time, that in primary visual cortex, orientations and spatial frequencies for every part of the retina are processed in parallel, lots of orientations, lots of spatial frequencies. And the straw man that I would use is that in most decoding models, people are trying to get one edge out or one orientation out. And so there's been less exploitation of this massively parallel nature. And I think in both 3D shape perception and material perception, it's almost essential. So the talk will be in two parts. And this will be the first part is on 3D shapes and orientation processing. So begin with this. This is a very nice symmetric gray level 2D picture, but even from where you're sitting, I suspect that your brains perversely see it as a folded 3D screen with a concavity inside and two convexities. So why is this, and how do we do it? And this is sometimes called the shape from texture problem, though probably shape from pattern would have been a better term. There's a long tradition in psychology, but some of the better work's been done in computer vision, unfortunately. And the basic idea is that on the surface, there is a texture. This is what the texture looks like. So every place where it doesn't look like that, it's because it's not frontal parallel to you. And so a number of people have come up with all kinds of clever ways of beginning from these distorted things and inferring this, and whatever geometrical transformation it takes to go from here to here also tells you what the geometry in 3D is, how this is away from the frontal parallel. Now, what is the basic assumption in all of these is that the texture on the surface is always the same, and so all the distortions are due to projection. Now, I'll show you examples where that's not quite true, and we still see shape from texture very well. And so instead of falling into this kind of inverse optics stuff, we decided we'd begin. Andrea Lee started as my postdoc in 2000 by just parsing these images in terms of local orientations and frequencies, which is what striate cortex does. And so what we did was use a number of different sorts of textures to separate spatial frequency and orientation information. So here you see this is the horizontal vertical plaid, and this is its Fourier transform, so you see these 4 points. This is what I will call an octotropic plaid. It's got 8 gratings equally spaced around the circle, and here is its Fourier transform. And this will be a useful one. I bet you can't tell very well the difference between these two, but this is exactly like this, except it's missing the horizontal grating. And in the Fourier transform, you can see the gap on the vertical part. And so these are all gratings. These are all textures made out of sort of what you can call one-dimensional components. People like to think of texture as something repeated like this with repeated elements. So we made as regular a one as you can with round dots regularly spaced. And here is this Fourier transform. And then we wanted to make the frequency spectrum broad. So we just randomized the sizes of the dots. And then to make the orientation spectrum fuzzy, we just randomized the locations of the dots. And we did a lot of experiments. I'm not going to show you very many results, just the pictures. But every experiment we did was done on a monitor. And we first began by taking these textures and folding them in this sinusoidal way, either with a convexity towards you or a concavity away from you in the center. And the nice thing about folding is that whatever is on the surface of the texture doesn't get changed. So it's always constant. And we projected them onto a monitor in a way that the image formed on your retina was exactly the same as if the actual object had been sort of folded around the monitor. And this is what the images look like. So this is the horizontal vertical clad, and this you saw before. And there are two things happening now that you know it's made of two sets of gratings. In the vertical grating, you will see that it's the frequency that changes. It's high here and low here and here. And in the horizontal grating, you will see that it's all curved like this. So the first question that comes up is, do you see the shape because you need all of this? Do you just need the vertical ones? Because there were people thinking that it was the frequency gradient that was doing it. Or do you need the horizontal ones? So here is the octotropic plaid with 8 sets of gratings. And again, you should be able to see a concavity in the center with 2 convexities. And you may also see these orientation flows over here. Now, this is exactly the same as this, except it's just missing the horizontal component. And now what you probably see are 3 bars, shallow bars on a background. And so that tells you that all things like texture gradients, frequency modulations, in this particular case are not sufficient. And it's these orientation, what I'll call these orientation flows following Steve Zucker, are the ones carrying the critical information here. So why is this happening? So the octotropic plaid, as I said, is 8 gratings like this. If you fold them and project them in perspective, this is what the horizontal one looks like, and it's carrying the shape of concave 2 convexes. And all the rest of them look like 3 bars on a background. And so if you take this out and you add them up, you're not going to get the shape. And what are these curvatures? Well, that's just simply perspective projection. So if this is your eye and this is your line of sight, and horizontally there's something bent away from you like this, well, it's going to project up like that on your retina. And if it's bent towards you, it's going to project down. And if it's above, it'll be the opposite. And so you can see that's what these convex and concave regions are like. And essentially, this part of the convex is like this part of the concave, and vice versa. Same thing happens when things are slanted away from you, and this is where the right slant and the left slant. Like, so all of these are separate. So what happens with the frequencies? Well, this is an XZ depiction. So suppose this is the surface, and it's identical here and here, but here it's slanted more with respect to the eye, and here it's slanted less. So now it will project to a shorter area, and this will project to a longer area. So the frequency will be higher here and lower here. So the more frontoparallel it is, whether it's convex or concave, is lower frequency, and the slants, because they're more slanted, are higher frequency. So this actually brings up a really interesting thing. There are 2 ways spatial frequency varies in 3D scenes. One is as a function of distance. So if you begin with this pattern, and you increase the distance 108, 131, and 208%, you see the frequency increasing. What happens if you slant it? This is frontoparallel 20, 40, and 60 degrees. Well, you also see the frequency increasing. And notice here you start seeing a frequency gradient. But up to at 20 and 40 degrees, you're really not seeing much of a gradient. You're just seeing a change in frequency. And the same thing if I slant it the other way. There's not much difference here. Here, there's a difference here. So one of the main things is the frequency is changing. But you may say, well, this is just a one-dimensional pattern. What happens if you begin with dots like this? Because now when you increase the distance, the dots get smaller, but isotropically. And so the frequency increases in both directions. However, when you slant it, the frequency only increases in this direction. So the shapes change. Okay. So now the question is, could you use this change in shape to tell you what's going on, or are you just stuck with looking at frequencies? So now let's look at this. So this is the regular dots, and you get all the nice shape here, but notice you're also seeing the orientation flows. Okay. And even when you jumble the sizes of the dots, you still get the orientation flows. Harder to model, but you get it. Now what happens when you put the dots in random locations? Well, now you should just see these three pillars. The concavity in the middle is gone. And you're seeing these dots turn into ellipses, but you can't see this as slanted just because that's what's happening. In other words, it's the kinds of things Bart was talking about. If your heuristic is that frequency changes are due to distance, and so inside an object, the higher frequency parts are further away from you and the lower frequency parts are closer to you, this is the percept you would get. And most of the time, changes in frequency are due to distance. So it may be a reasonable heuristic, and here it just goes wrong. So that was a folded surface, and there the texture doesn't change on the surface. But you can have many more degrees of freedom by carving, deforming, eroding, all kinds of other things. So I'll just show an example of a carved solid, but we carve it with the same sinusoidal corrugated front. And here's one example. Suppose there's a pattern, there's a material with a regular pattern that just gets propagated perfectly down here, and we're going to carve it like this. Now when you carve it like this, so again, this is an XZ thing. So this is the material, it's the same pattern propagated up. The steeper you carve it, the lower the frequency on the surface now. Now this is not in the projection, this is on the surface as compared to here. So this surface, this carved surface, will not have a homogeneous pattern on its surface. So none of those models from computer vision are going to work very well. Now the interesting thing is that the steeper you carve it, this is low frequency, but it projects to a higher frequency. This is higher frequency, but it projects to a lower frequency, and the two sort of, there's not that much difference over here. They sort of cancel each other out, and the spatial frequency does become a function of distance. So now what happens? We go back to the same patterns. You may notice that the horizontal component looks very much like what it did before, which is what you should expect, because even you're carving it, you're not doing anything to the horizontal component. The vertical component now is very different, and this now looks much smoother and shallower. The vertical component has the lowest frequency here and the highest frequency here as a function of distance, which is why it looks nicely smooth. So this is the octotropic flat, which has this component in it, but you're not seeing a shape here. So what's going on? Well, that tells you something about what happens in the brain, even though the information is there. So this I already showed you. So what happens when we carve it and project it in perspective? Well, this one is identical to this, like I said. But now look at the neighboring ones. They're also carrying shape. Notice here, these local orientations are very different from here, but here they're sort of similar to here. So we thought what might be happening is interference from these. So we began with this, where you don't see shape. We subtracted this, and now the horizontal component comes out, and you get the shape. So it's important to have the information, but then it's important to be able to extract it also. So here are the dots. No surprise that you can see it here because you got the flows, and here too. This is interesting because under forced choice things, under monocular presentation properly in perspective, you may actually see this as slightly convex and this is slightly convex, because the distances, the sizes are just right now for distance. But this also tells you something else, that when we do it, you can get the 3D percept much shallower than this, but you can get it, people get it right. But if you ask them where were the dots smaller, it's not that easy to tell. So we are better off at picking the 3D than the 2D sizes here. And those are all one-dimensional curvatures and one-dimensional textures. So here I just wanted to show you that one can make 2D curvatures with 2D orientation flows. This is a concavity in the center, convexity. This is a saddle. This is another saddle, convex in one way, concave in the other. And here it is with dots and then with the random dots. And this works just as well, except that you now need a 2D texture. And this functions so well, and since I'm in Japan, I had to use something from Kiraoka. So you should be able to see this as convex and this as concave. Everybody see that? Well, all of these orientation flows are completely illusory. These lines are actually all horizontal and vertical. But so you can get this you can get the shape from illusions also. How about natural textures? So we looked at the Brodat set, and so here, which is natural and man-made textures, as you know. And some textures convey the shape concave, convex, but here you can't see them. And what we did was we said, all right, how about, is it the amplitude spectrum or the phase spectrum that's important? So in the texture, before folding it, we just randomized the phase, and we looked here, and as you can see, it makes no difference. These are still conveying shape, and these are still not conveying shape. So it's in the amplitude spectrum. Well, you may also notice that the amplitude spectrum has a lot of the structure, which is what is true for textured things. It's not the phase spectrum, it's the amplitude spectrum that has it. So we made a simple model like this, where you had to have, in the Fourier transforms of the spectrum, you had to have energy in this dimension, but not in the surrounding, so it was discrete in here, and we were able to predict almost 98% of the textures correctly, and which would convey the shape and which one wouldn't. Now, the interesting thing is that we've been picking up what I've been calling these orientation flows in the presence of many other orientations at the same retinal locations. And that makes an interesting problem for the cortex to do. So here is the octotropic plaid flat, and as you saw before, you really can't even tell me whether there's a horizontal component in here, because when I took it out, it looked just about the same. But now look what happens if I slant it. This part just jumps out at you, all right? So there could be two reasons. One could be that all the rest of them become higher frequency, whereas this one stays that, so it's more visible because of the human bandpass sensitivity to frequencies. Or the other possibility could be that in the cortex, there are cross-orientation inhibitions, and that they are frequency specific. And so they get, so these, all the other orientations are still inhibiting each other, and this one sort of starts jumping out. But notice that even here, you have all these other orientations, but you're still picking out stuff. And this is what I mean, where the parallel nature of striate cortex comes out, because you don't want to lose all this information. You want to know what the texture is, and you want to know what the flows are. So you don't want to decode to get a single orientation for retinal location. You want to keep all this information till later. So even if you make simple models of thalamic-based models of cross-orientation inhibition, as long as these cells are fairly circularly symmetric, you can imagine, and this is, we just did some simulations, that the response suppression is highest when the frequency of a grading and the mask are the same. And so there is a frequency dependence that comes out of here. So with Keith Perper and John Victor, we decided to look at it in striate cortex. There was a monkey having some other experiments done on it, and we sort of piggybacked this experiment on. So we would find cells and find the preferred orientation, and then we would put stimuli like this lined up with the preferred orientation. And we did on-off sorts of presentations and all kinds of, and this is just to show you the electrode penetrations in V1 and V2. And here are the first results. So this is V1, this is V2. So we're looking at the responses to a plaid minus the grating, where this grating is at the preferred orientation of the cell. They were not all vertically preferring, but this is just keep rotating it for that. And in almost all the cases except this, there's a smaller response to this than to this, showing the classical cross-orientation inhibition. The interesting case is this, where this is the frontoparallel one, and now we slant it, so the orientation flows are along the preferred orientation of the cell. And in V1, it's up and down, there's nothing straight. But in V2, the diamonds mean there's a significant effect, and otherwise it's not a significant effect. You see this consistent thing and a whole bunch of cells which prefer this to this, and now the next thing is to go figure out exactly why this is happening. So we now saw that this cross-orientation inhibition, it's helping you pick stuff out. And the idea was, is this all hardwired? So for example, one could think of, think of making later cells which just line up these cells in template sorts of things, or match filters to get slants, to get curvatures. And so one of the things we discovered, Elias Cohen and I, was that if you took this textured thing, which looks like a convexity, and you just rotated it by 45 degrees, it actually looks shallower. And here is the data showing just that. And these are exactly the same images, just rotated. And so we said, well, we know it's these flows that are carrying it, and maybe what's happening is it's these 2D angles that get shallower if you make them oblique. And yes, that was true. And as I said, I took all the equations, but you could predict from this the earlier result. They match perfectly. And so we made a population decoding model, a Sanger type 1, using Poisson cells, and it had no free parameters at all. But what we used was stuff from Lee and Freeman on variation in orientation tuning curves in the cortex as a function of orientation and of numbers of cells. This turned out not to be important. This turned out to be very important. And I'm just going to show you the decoding results. So it's a 140-degree angle oriented oblique or vertical. This is when it's oblique. It's seen as 142. It's decoded as 142. And when it's vertical, it's decoded as 138, which is a 4-degree difference, which is almost exactly what the psychophysics had, which is 4.5 degrees. And so this made us think that there's this hardwired thing that's going on. And so now we were interested in seeing, well, okay, so the orientations are hardwired. How about the frequencies? So these are little chunks of what you've seen before. So flat, convex, concave, right slant, left slant, all looking right. Now here is with the random dots, and these two both look convex, and these two both look sort of very shallowly concave. So we used a phantom, presented these, and tried to see if we made people see this as, feel this as concave or convex, or right slant or left slant, would it change things? Now, this may look like a very complex graph, but it's actually very simple. This is with no feedback. These are symbols which the direction of the triangle actually tells you what's going on. So without feedback, both the concave and the convex essentially look convex. And without feedback, the right slant and left slant both look concave. When you give consistent feedback, this gets corrected. This becomes concave, this stays convex. This becomes left slant, this becomes right slant. Interestingly, if you give the opposite feedback, you can just turn these around. You can turn these around. Now, and it's very interesting. When you do this and you keep touching it, you actually see the surface change. Okay. And just as controls, if you give a flat feedback, it doesn't change from this. Your brain isn't willing to believe the flatness. It takes a visual thing. If you take a flat surface and give feedback for concave, convex, left slant, and right slant, again, your brain doesn't believe it. It just says it as flat. And if you take the plaid texture, which you already see vertical, and you give it the opposite feedback, it makes no difference. That's the visuals. The orientation information is just too strong. And so this was really interesting, and it fitted in with Berkeley saying, oh, well, maybe we learn vision through touch, to answer one of Bart's things. So, but what we noticed was as soon as we would stop touching it, you could actually see the surface go back to what it was originally, just slightly weird. So what we did was we timed it. We took the right slant and left slant with the dots. This is how you begin looking at them. You touch it for 40 seconds, and they now become right slanted and left slanted. And then you stop it, and you ask people every 5 seconds what it looks like. And so it stays like this a little bit, but in 10 seconds, it sort of goes back to what it is. So it's a strong effect perceptually, but it's very temporary and quite local, actually. So just to summarize this first part, what I've shown you is how important orientations are for getting 3D shapes, and how important the parallel nature of striate cortex is for getting all of this information to later cells, especially when you have multiple curvatures, like in 2 dimensions. And that the orientation information seems hardwired, and the frequency information seems fairly plastic. So now to the second part, which is, since I said spatial frequency also, now material perception and frequency processing. So I think one of the right ways to study materials is to look for affordance, what Gibson called affordances. which is look at properties that are really quite useful. And I'm not usually that utilitarian, because I'm only a naturalized American citizen, not genetically an American citizen. So what we did is, Martin Giesel and I, is we got a grant, we went all around the world, and we photographed about 200 and some materials. But that was only in our dreams. Actually, we sat on Google and got these. So these are the samples we used. And what we had was we gave people questions like, if you felt this material on your skin, would it feel soft or rough? If you folded or draped this material, would it be stiff or flexible? And then they had to take a 5-point scale, and they say mostly A or mostly B. So more A than B, more B than A, or equally. And so this is soft, rough, flexible, stiff. And then would you use this material to repel water, or would you use it to absorb water, absorbent, repellent? Would clothes made of this material keep you warm or cool, warm or cool? And so there were whole sets of materials on which there was fairly high consensus. So these all graded soft, rough, flexible, stiff, water absorbent, water repellent, warm, cool. We also did shiny and matte, but it just was too high resolution for our, the fabrics don't follow the skew rule of the Japanese-MIT rule for shininess, because they just have highlights all over, essentially. It's not in a limited part of the image. And it was just too high contrast, too high resolution for us to do on our monitor, so we dropped that part. But of course, as you can imagine, there are also associated affordances. So soft and flexible often go together. Rough and stiff often went together. Water absorbent and warm often went together because they're thick absorbing materials. Water repellent and rough often went together because they were, plasticky sorts of things. Flexible and cool often went together because thinner materials are more flexible. So to try to reduce the dimensionality, we use this correspondence analysis, which just does the singular value decomposition on the chi-square statistics of associations across all the stuff. And first dimension got about 60%, and the second dimension about a little less than 30%. So it was about 85% total for 2 dimensions. And the first dimension seems more like a stiff, flexible, rough, soft dimension going together. And these are, of course, as I showed, quite associated. And the other one was more like a thickness dimension, which is warm and cool. So what we did was separate the fabrics into properties that seem to go from the correspondence analysis. So here is soft versus rough. And when we looked at them, and we looked at their global Fourier transforms, an interesting thing jumped out, that the rough ones, this is just one example, it's true for whole classes, just seem to have more energy in the higher frequencies than the soft ones did. And this is shown here as histogram. So here's spatial frequency in cycles per degree. This is the relative energy. The blue parts are where the soft is higher in energy, and the red parts where the rough is, and you can see it falling, the softs over here and the roughs over here in the high frequencies. And here is, so what we saw were most of the ones that were being called flexible were the ones which had some undulations like this. So we just called it undulated. So with undulated and flat, what we noticed was that right at the very low frequencies, there was more energy in these undulated ones, which is not surprising because there are just a few folds in here. And here is a spatial frequency histograms, and now you can see that the undulated are very high in the low frequencies, and the flat ones here are higher here. Oh, and I should say they were all sort of equated for energy, so that's taken care of. So here are thick versus thin, and again, the thick ones, this is like the thin ones are higher here, and the thick ones are higher in this medium band. So what we did was just looking at this part was just eyeballing. We picked 3 frequency bands. So this one for undulation from 0.5 to 2.3 cycles per degree. So one of the reasons one of the reasons we chose to look at fabrics is, first of all, they have very, very wide uses. And the second thing is, to judge them, you almost always look at them at roughly the same distance. So we could control for that sort of naturally. So this is cycles per degree for the images that we had, and I'll talk about images, image frequencies with the retinal frequencies in a minute. And so here's a slightly higher band for thickness and a higher band for roughness. And we wanted to see if we began with these images and we changed the energy in these bands, what would happen. So we began with these images, took the Fourier transform, changed the energy in one band or the other, took the inverse Fourier transform, and got something like this, keeping the total energy constant. So it's changing the relative energy in certain bands. And this is what we found. So here is the quilt, and you'll see me, I'm taking the air out of this quilt over here, and now I'm pumping it up with air again. Everybody see that air being filled in and taken out? Okay, well, I'm doing nothing of that sort. What I'm doing is I'm beginning with this. Here is this frequency spectrum, and I'm taking out energy in this band. Here it's gone to 0. Or I'm increasing the energy in this band. And so this is all here. So everybody sees this as changes in the inflation and deflation of the stuff. All right, when we sent this to Current Biology, there was one reviewer who said that they could only see changes in spatial frequency. That's why it didn't get published in Current Biology. It's slightly political. So here is thicker and thinner. So again, this is the base image, and you could see it getting to a very flat weave, and then you will see it getting to a thicker and thicker weave, and again, it's the same trick, and now in this band. So all I'm changing is the relative energy in one band, increasing it and decreasing it, as you can see. And here is the roughness one, so here's the rough thing, and it starts getting to where if you touched it, it would not feel as rough, and now it would feel quite rough if you touched it. And again, it's the same thing, but it's now in this band. So you're talking to Reinhard Klein, and he says, oh, you should be able to use that to change properties of fabrics very quickly. So here is a fabric that was rated as stiff consistently by our observers. This is as flexible by our observers. So we took this, and we took the phase spectrum of this one and changed the phase spectrum of this to this. So you can see that some of the herringbone is a little disturbed, but not by much, because it's all in the amplitude spectrum. But you can now see the lines where the folds are going to be from the phase spectrum. That's all the phase spectrum is doing. And then what we did was in this part of the amplitude spectrum, we increased the energy to this level, and now you see a nice folded fabric sitting over here. This is for Kavita, because she asked if we had anything to do with computer graphics people. So now, just like I'd manipulated that, we can manipulate all kinds of fabrics and change their properties, and we can use them in adaptation and distance experiments. So what we did was we adapted to band-filtered noise in the bands that we were interested in, and this is the notch-filtered version of it, so all the frequencies except what's in here. And so this is the adaptation paradigm. It's a standard adaptation paradigm. And here are the results, and I won't go too far. Hey, I'm doing very well. I decided to talk like Sliman very fast, and it's helping. So the black ones are the pre-adaptation ratings of undulation, thickness, and roughness, and the red ones are the post-adaptation. And you can see that by adapting, you can decrease your percept of each of those properties compared to the notch-filtered one. So adapting out different spatial frequency bands or different cells that are sensitive to different spatial frequencies can change your perceived properties. And then we use the same materials to answer this other question, where is it retinal or is it some material spatial frequency? And so what we did was we put the comparison monitor at 100 centimeters or 99 centimeters, and either had the test monitor for comparison at the same distance or twice as far or half as far. So this is making all the frequencies half and making all the frequencies double. And so the black stuff are the ratings again of more volume, thicker and rougher, more undulation. And then the blue ones for the far and the red ones for the near. And this is one place where it's showing up, but mostly the effects are really small. I mean, the frequencies are changing by 2. And now that's seemed like, oh, well, maybe we were completely wrong. But it actually turns out that we really are very good at balancing spatial frequencies within images. And this is not the only result like this. People, a long time ago, Dave Parrish and George Sperling found that in identifying letters, for example, it's the image spatial frequencies that matter rather than the retinal spatial frequencies. And when people have looked at memory for spatial frequencies and so on, it almost always ends up being what psychologists like to call the distal spatial frequency rather than the proximal spatial frequency. Some people are nodding. I didn't even know this stuff till recently, this terminology. Now we pick those bands up, using the neural networks and the conv nets which are in our own brains. So we decided we'd do the fashionable thing and see if we could get them out of the images. So what we did was, this is a less controlled experiment, but in some ways more reliable. We printed out the images on papers, and we gave people a 9 level things for the properties, so from 1 to 9, and we just had them, they could move around the 200 or so images as much as they liked from different categories till they were satisfied that each was in its own category and they were ranked properly. And then when we took those rankings and we divided the spatial frequency into about 30 bands, and we did a canonical correlation analysis, which is a generalization of multivariate regression, where not only are you allowed combinations of the dependent variables, but also combinations of the independent variables. So it's like the most general linear model that there is. And what it gives you is, so for each of these properties then, we could get the band that was coming out of here. And these gray levels are the bands we had picked for undulation, thickness, and roughness. And these are the bands that came out of this canonical correlation analysis. And you can see that the undulation band is highest over here and then peters out over here. And the thickness band is highest right around where we picked. And the roughness band is again highest around where we picked. So what that says is that the conv nets in our brains work quite well. And now this isn't going to work because it really needs much higher resolution. So we were interested in an obvious thing. You could have something which was rough and undulated also, or thick and rough versus thick and soft, and so on. So we played around with making matrices of things using these 3 bands. And if I showed you each one of these on a full monitor, it's actually quite convincing, and you can do it. In other words, you can in parallel get these properties. Now, the brain doesn't do global Fourier analyses. It uses filters, which are localized in space, orientation, and spatial frequency. So as a first attempt, we used the pyramids from Simoncelli and Freeman, and we used 4 scales. So this is the finest one, and then you get coarser and coarser. These are just examples of it, but this is run over whole classes of flat, undulated, thin, thick, rough, and smooth surfaces. And these are heat maps in gray levels. This is orientation, but you can avoid, you don't have to worry about that. And the part that you have to think about is these heat maps are not all equivalent. So when you look at undulated and flat, it's nice that this is over here and this is over here. But this is also going from 0 to 40, and this is going from 0 to 1. So there's just not much energy in here. Similarly, with thick and thin, they may look similar, but this is only going up to 40, and this is, so here it's this part here and this part here that shows up. And in here and here, they may look alike, but this is going from 0 to 50, and this is going from 0 to 10. So there's just a lot more energy here. Okay. And one can plot this another way, which is we take the 9 ratings we had for undulated, thick, and rough, and we plot them as what the amplitude is for all of those in those categories together. So on the filters outputs from coarse to fine, and the more undulated ones are higher here, and the less undulated ones are low over here, as you would expect in the coarse part. For thick and thin, it's the differences over here. And for the rough ones, the biggest difference is here at the finest scale. And finally, what's the relationship between the properties we extracted and the affordances? We just correlated the rankings versus the original ratings. And so here were the affordances we got, and it's quite nice. So let's take the warm one, all right? So it doesn't matter so much whether you are undulated. It doesn't matter whether you are rough or not. Those are correlations around 0. It's the thickness which got rated as stuff. So for the ones which were called flexible, it's quite clearly if they were undulated, that's what is the highest correlation. And for water repellent, it's turned out to be the roughness part which was working. And also with rough and roughness, you would want a correlation, and you do. So to summarize the thing on frequencies and material properties, material affordances are combinations of material properties. At structure at specific scales is related to specific material properties. So that structure comes just from the physical nature of materials, that rough ones just have, they just have a finer structure. But all of the stuff that I've shown you was really shape from shading. And it's the shape from shading at different scales that's helping you to make these judgments. And what I have shown you here essentially is something very simple, which is the shape from shading at different scales depends on the relative energy at those particular scales. And I can change it separately. So I can have shape from shading at many different scales depending on how much relative energy there is at those scales. It's just simple. You can have the structure in your image, but you can change which structure comes out better. You can adapt to bandpass limited noise. It suggests that later cells combine frequency information within limited bands. But also, as I would say, you need all the different scales to come out of striate cortex to extra striate cortex to be able to be used by later cells. The relative invariance of perceived properties of distance suggests material object-based inferences, which are of higher order than anything I've talked over here. The parallel processing of multiple scales enables simultaneous inference of multiple properties. And also, the nice thing about filters, which you don't get out of the global thing, is the filters can give you the amplitude and the phase information. So let's take the coarsest filters. Their locations would, for example, tell you where the undulations are. I mean, where the responses were high. And again, to answer Kavita's question about links to computer graphics, they are, so Vicky Interante's group in Minnesota has taken our orientation. This she did about 5-6 years ago. She took our orientation results. And these are just synthetic sorts of shapes she made, but these are two nice kinds of textures that work. This is a two-dimensional texture for these two-dimensional curvatures, but these are sort of giving you, so one of the things I forgot to say about the shape from texture stuff is those perspective orientation flows are exactly what you would get as the occluding contour of a bent surface too. And if you reduced its height to lower and lower eye height, that's exactly what the pattern was that was changing. So these are sort of the planar cuts, and they work quite well, but probably not as well as this. And then Reinhard Klein's group has taken, this is the leather object. This is to show you that you don't need only flat things. And they can make it more puffy leather or a less puffy leather. And they've essentially done a whole series of things for many different qualities using just the relative energy in spatial frequencies. And that's really, really fast. And as you know, editing fabrics and computer graphics is a big problem. And this is just an extremely fast way to do it. And this is where I'll stop. 32 seconds still left. Wow, pretty good.
No. Question time. So, although he spent all his question time, but I welcome.
I misread read that completely.
I welcome.
Oh, okay. Now I know why people were saying that you should leave the amount left for the top, because I was sort of using that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yes.
The point is
That's why I slowed down.
how hungry you are, but if you can be patient, so I would happy to have questions.
So the V2 result is a fascinating physiological confirmation of the texture flow work. And so I take it that there was a directionality preference for those apparent slants.
Yeah, it worked when the slant was in the preferred orientation of the cell.
I know, I guessed that, but then I also wonder if it worked when the convergence was in one direction specifically, not in the other direction specifically.
That those cells couldn't tell.
Really?
Yeah.
Because that seems like a much less useful signal.
Well, because I don't think you're getting the surface out of V2. But what you are getting is you're getting the orientation flow out of V2. And something later on can then, and remember, these cells are still, even though V2 cells
But
are
if it's
still
an
local.
ambiguous signal about the direction of orientation flow.
You can think about it, it's giving you the axis of the slant,
Uh-huh.
and now, which
But
is
not
already in
but
a
not
positive,
the
then
direction.
something later is going to get the direction of the slant.
I guess. Yeah.
Everybody's hungry?
So Qasim, I'm trying to understand this 3D result, because one of the things that I was thinking about when you're showing your filtering on the images is that that would only work on images. So I'm trying to understand what you're doing here. Are you doing this in the graphics world before you do the wrapping?
No, he's doing it in real time in 3D. All he's doing is,
But this is something that's wrapped on the 3D structure.
right. But what he's doing is that he just changes. He's doing something more clever. All right. So the one thing I didn't talk about is what happens in slant.
That's
all right?
that's
Okay.
basically what I'm asking. Yeah,
So now,
connect the two tabs.
if you go look at the Curate database, it's very interesting that there are a whole series of things like stucco, where when you slant them, they actually look completely different materials.
Right.
Okay, and because slant changes in 3D, it changes the spatial frequency enormously, and it sort of fits in with there's a whole supplement to this paper where we looked at a whole bunch of these things, and it fits in with that. So what he did as a clever thing was he would take the spatial frequency at each point on the image. And so he was essentially, he's doing something slightly more clever. He's doing a relative
I see.
thing there, all right? But he's doing, all it is spatial frequency manipulation here.
So for your last point, that are you saying that the amplitude spectrum is enough, or for example, you can check that whether the phase randomization, probably that will destroy the many structures, so that the not only the amplitude spectrum but also other information is necessary.
Well,
so what's the point of your argument?
The thing is, when you have texture, which is fairly regular and high frequency, that's already in the amplitude spectrum. You can imagine if you're going to make it out of sine waves, you're going to have to put them in the right places to add up and so on. And as you saw with the herringbone, by essentially putting the phase spectrum or something flat, which was fairly random, it didn't make very much of a difference. But the phase spectrum in the material case sort of gives you the position, the locations of certain things. Once you get into filters, you don't have to worry about the amplitude and phase spectrum. You just have to get the responses of the filters, and that's the next step.
Thank you very much. Now, as planned, the afternoon session will start from 1 o'clock.